Confusion in the UK over a quarantine policy. Travellers from Portugal will have to isolate when arriving in Scotland and Wales, but they won't have to do so if entering England. The government has said countries with COVID-19 cases higher than 20 per 100,000 people are at risk of being added to this quarantine list. Over in Portugal, the number of COVID-19 cases has risen to 23 per 100,000 people in the past week. We go now to Ollie Barrett in London for the latest on this story. Ollie, the government is receiving lots of flack for this latest move. Why is Portugal still on the exempted list for England?
Well, the government in London says that it doesn't actually just look at the rate of people out of 100,000 who have coronavirus, and therefore there are other factors that it takes into consideration. The trajectory of the outbreak in countries that it's looking at, the testing regime in countries that it's examining, the actions being taken by governments abroad when those cases start to tick up. And it looked at all of that with regards to Portugal and decided that quarantine at this point wasn't yet necessary for arrivals into England. But it is a competency, a decision for the governments of the nations of the United Kingdom. So England takes its decision, Scotland takes its decision. They are normally very similar indeed, maybe slightly timed differently, but normally very similar indeed. With Portugal, though, and with Greece as well now, we do have differences opening up between the nations of the United Kingdom. Certainly in terms of the government getting flack, there are a lot of travellers who headed back early to England to avoid the quarantine they thought was coming in. They didn't actually need to do so. There are travellers that cancelled holidays to Portugal thinking that quarantine was going to be required on their return. They didn't need to do so, it turns out, either. At the same time, we should say there is, according to the polls, broad support for the government's policy of putting quarantine in place for arrivals from countries deemed high risk.
Tourist frustrations aside, Ollie, how effective then is this measure for the UK then, given that Scotland and England have different stances on who needs to serve quarantine?
You could, of course, Steve, land at an airport in England, drive across the border into Scotland or Wales. Now, the governments in Scotland and Wales, if you'd come back from Portugal or parts of Greece, would still expect you to quarantine when you got there. But certainly it does make it hard to police. There are also ongoing questions about exactly how much policing is being done of the quarantine measure anyway. Very few people at all have come into contact with authorities and have been fined or prosecuted for not quarantining in the way that they are told to do. What the governments in all the four nations are really trying to do here is cut down human contacts for people who have returned from countries currently deemed high risk. Questions also from the travel industry about why the UK is still not putting in place testing on arrival at ports and airports. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, reiterating again today that scientists advising the various parts of the UK government are saying that a test on arrival isn't particularly effective because you could be incubating the virus and be asymptomatic and only test positive a few days later. But Heathrow Airport is just one part of the travel industry here in the UK saying that may be the case, but let us put a regime in place so you have two tests, one 4 or 5 days after your arrival back in the UK. That could mean that you cut quarantine time down from a couple of weeks to 1 week and get people back out into the economy much more quickly and much more likely to book holidays and flights in the first place. So this is certainly a raging debate here in the UK at the moment.
Quarantine and testing policy is something of a work in progress. Ollie, thank you very much for that. Ollie Barrett there speaking to us from London.